but not so quick to condemn the execution squads, and that isn't an exaggeration. Freddie Gray's name is added to a long and sordid list that includes 7-year-old Ayanna Jones, that includes pensioner and former Marine Kenneth Chamberlain, that includes the more well-known Oscar Grant and Romali Graham, and of course all those killed by vigilantes. Unpunished murder in the world's self-styled largest democracy. I wouldn't call it anti-Americanism. Being critical of the shortcomings of a society doesn't mean you're anti that society. In fact, it means you're pro that society, because it means you want better for that society. But those who wish for America to remain an overtly or covertly white supremacist state in which black people are kept in their place, so to speak, think to criticize those death squads is anti-American. Within the UK, because of the welfare state and various other mitigating circumstances, the situation isn't as extreme. So it would be an exaggeration to say it's the same, but there are broad similarities. There is a long history of police brutality towards particularly black and Asian communities, but even Irish communities, when the Irish were considered the enemy in this country, that continues unabated and unpunished to this day. And then the coverage is the same. I mean, with Mark Duggan, there was the famous thing where the media ran a picture where he had a really somber and upset look on his face. And we found out they'd cut out a heart that he was holding. He was stood at his daughter's grave. Think about the profoundness of that. This man was stood at the grave of his child, mourning. In a society like this, in a society built on private property, to be poor is a crime. To be poor and black is especially a crime. And so those narratives are birthed out of this set of ideologies where to give a profound counterbalance, where the Norwegian terrorist a few years ago who killed 78 people, or the pilot of that German wings flight who deliberately crashed 150 people into the side of a mountain because they're white, are portrayed with more humanity in the media than teenage black victims of state murder. Of course, it creates despondency. It creates a feeling of desperation. One of the reasons the Scottish independence referendum was so successful in terms of turnout was because there was a practical outcome. If you live in a segregated community, even in this country, or relatively segregated, where police brutality and poverty and imperialism are maybe the problems that affect you, you don't see anyone who really looks like they're going to challenge that. It's going to make you despondent towards the whole democratic process. If there are people in your community who've been killed or died suspiciously in police custody, and you've seen how the process of justice pans out for people like you, you're not going to have that much faith in the so-called democratic forces of the nation. Operation Black Vote in and of itself is not a bad idea. Arguing that black communities can and should potentially organise to vote around particular issues that affect them, particularly in potentially swing seats, is not a terrible idea as long as we're honest about the limitations of that. But problematizing black people who don't vote is quite patronising. And this kind of finger wagging of, if you don't vote, you're taking the colour out of Britain, naturally is going to offend some people and put some people off. What needs to be questioned is the lack of direct democracy that we experience that causes the despondency. Black faces in higher places, if we look at the history of politics, is meaningless. I mean, Obama is in the White House right now. As execution after execution after execution has gone on, Obama is in the White House right now as the bombing of an African country has occurred on his watch. So merely having someone with a bit of melanin dress up capitalism and white supremacy and all of these other ills of society doesn't do anything to change anything if that person does not have a different agenda. Someone isn't necessarily moral just because they have a darker shade of skin. So to me, when I see people be adopted by the political establishment, I look to see if their rhetoric changes. I've seen politicians go in this country and keep their dignity. Bernie Grant being a great example. He kept his dignity. He was still a voice for that community, not for the Labour Party and not for the British establishment. And that's why he was a bit of a thorn in the side, despite being in the system. So one can keep one's dignity if you choose to, but you'll find yourself maybe a bit ostracised and not invited to the big dinner parties and certain, not be in the club, so to speak, if you continue to represent your constituency. Particularly if you've grown up in a poor environment, poverty is not nice. No one wants to stay poor, despite loving your community. So someone offers you money and a salary and a steady job. Those things are attractive to everyone. So it's not even a personal indictment always of those people. It's an indictment of the nature of the way politics are played. So it's really a choice of who's going to manage the affairs of transnational corporations in this country and how the crumbs from things like the bombing of Libya and Iraq and British foreign policy, combined with the profit of transnational corporations, will be sprinkled down. And that does make a difference, minimum wage changing. There are small practical differences that do affect people's everyday lives within Britain. But we're not for justice if we're only for justice within Britain. If we're saying we want a decent standard of living, we want this, we want that, but we don't really mind what our government does elsewhere in the world to give us that standard of living. After the bombing of Libya, I can't remember which one of the mainstream newspapers it was that ran it, so I don't want to quote, but I remember seeing it vividly, talking about the fact that the price of oil would now be 4 pence cheaper. Hooray. Austerity can be manipulated difficult circumstances can be manipulated. We've seen the whipping up of this anti-immigration nonsense by many of the mainstream parties, but particularly by the new kids on the block. But we see how, rather than addressing why, I mean, really, who's in charge of the poverty in your community? The Bangladeshi immigrant who cleans your local school, or the person who controls the levers of power and privilege in the society? I mean, the unintelligence of the argument it's astounding. It's a great way of playing divide and rule, and it also avoids people really looking at themselves and their own failings and looking at the history of their own oppression within this society. It's easier to blame the funny-looking people that come from Britain's former colonies. In fact, Britain's continued commonwealth. What does that even mean, to have a commonwealth? Don't act like the victim when you go out and mother countries around the world, and then the children that you've mothered come home to the mother country. Ironically, I'm not actually as pessimistic as reality would sometimes force us to be. The fact is, as we're seeing in Baltimore, as we're seeing all across the globe, as we're seeing, I saw an inspiring brother from Los Angeles who's become a guerrilla gardener in one of the worst ghettos in America, where he goes around growing stuff on the pavement so people can feed themselves nutritious food, because nutritious food is not available in the segregated ghettos of America. What I'm seeing is people refuse to just die quietly and give up and be the ants and insignificant dots that people wish poor people, particularly poor people of color, would be. There is still resistance, there is still humanity, there is still determination, in spite of all of the odds. And to me, I'm very inspired by that. And I see, despite the challenges that we face, there will always be resistance, and there will always be forms of victory, if not victory overall. To a point, but if they're seen in any way to understand the so-called rioters and looters in Baltimore, you'll start to see pressure be applied to them. If they're seen in any way to explain the mitigating circumstances in which this form of explosion occur, that's seen as sympathy or apologia or all of these kind of things. So what I'm saying is, people in positions of power and influence are often used. Look what happened to Muhammad Ali when he got up and spoke. And that is an exceptional circumstance. If people that famous with that much influence and that much wealth come out and say the things that I'm saying to you, no doubt the people who support them, who pay them, who are in positions of influence behind the camera, will penalise them for that, because it's threatening their interests. So for some artists, we have a degree more freedom, but really that also comes down to the people at home, the supporters who allow independent artists, myself, Immortal Technique, Low-Key, people within hip-hop particularly, to have had a voice, because there are people that will come out and support you, and you can feed yourself independently of needing to be a worker bee for a mainstream label, for a big corporate entity. You know, if you look at the music industry, the people that own the music industry, music isn't even their biggest interest. You know, we're talking about corporations for whom music is a very small part of their businesses. So promoting artists that openly question, sometimes it's profitable. Bob Marley, Rage Against the Machine, there's a long history of revolutionary artists making lots and lots of money. Interestingly, quite a few of them end up dead. Bob Marley, Jimi Hendrix, Sam Cooke, etc., etc., etc. But there's money to be made in that, and some people say capitalism will sell you the rope with which to hang it, and maybe that's true to a degree with music. So it's not like the censorship is complete and absolute.